the City of Eugene Budget Committee to order. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I very much appreciate it. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format, which enables the Budget Committee to meet and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. I want to specifically welcome Jesse Maldonado, our newest member of the committee, appointed effective July 1st of last summer, but attending his first meeting because of our schedule. So Jesse, it's great to have you here. Meeting's yours. I'll toss it to you now.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I am unfortunately in an airport, so if it's loud, I apologize, but schedules didn't align, but that's just how it goes, I guess. I'm very excited to be here.
I was going to say, if you weren't in an airport, you're the one person who I actually think could just take the meeting and run with it from what I saw in the orientation. So we're very lucky to have you there.
Well,
thank you so much.
I am happy to be here and excited to meet you all. Thanks.
Well, it's a privilege to serve with you, Jesse, and everyone here. It's a privilege to be able to be a part of this process. And I encourage everyone, as we're going through all of our proceedings on this committee, always to recall the privilege it is to be here, and that not everyone in the community shares that privilege, that many of the people who will be most affected by any decisions we make regarding our city's budget are simultaneously among those least able to participate in meetings like this. So I appreciate us keeping that in our thoughts always. My approach this year to both this meeting and whatever else we may do is similar to the last budget cycle. I'm going to focus on giving every member of the committee their equal opportunities to participate, to share their perspectives so that we can be as informed as possible as we enter any points of debate. So I'll be tossing it to the city manager for a presentation, and then we'll do a round robin. I will throw the order of that up in chat just so people can have a little advanced warning of where I'll call on you. And then we can have a traditional queue for further discussion. After our discussion tonight is complete, we have the minutes to approve and a little bit of wrap up, and then we can go about our evenings. So with that, City Manager, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also really excited to be here. And as I was reflecting on today, I was thinking about how there's a lot of things about the budget and the financial picture of the city that's been so challenging over the last few years that I wouldn't categorize it as like necessarily fun, but I've really enjoyed the actual budget committee process and these presentations and the work we've done together. So I'm really grateful, and I'm also happy to welcome Jesse to the team. We also have a number of new team members, a lot of shifting and changing, which is great, and it also creates some other challenges. But I wanted to just say a couple of people, and then when it gets to Twyla, she can introduce the finance folks. But I did want to say, since we last saw you, we have brought a new executive director onto the team. So our new LRCS director, who took Renee's place and then Ben's place, Joshua Bates. So welcome, Joshua. This will be Josh's first budget committee meeting, I think. Really excited to have him on the team. And then we also did some restructuring. So Twyla, who will present a little bit later as our CFO, has joined the executive team, as has the chief of staff, who is the city manager's office division manager, partially from the communications role and for lots of other reasons. So I don't know if she's on the call today. And we are in the process of recruiting a new public works director. So there's a lot of leadership changes and things to hold together. So I'm going to give, what's going to happen is I'm going to talk for a couple of slides, give a little bit of context to where we've been, and then Maurizio is going to give us an incredible financial forecast. We're going to go a little deeper than we have in the past. And then it'll turn over to Twyla, who's going to walk through the supplemental, and it'll come back to me. And we're going to try to get through all that in about 30 minutes if I stop talking sooner than later. So Maurizio, if you want to pull the presentation up, I'll just kind of kick it off. All right. Thank you. All right, we're working on the technology of passing things back and forth. So Jesse, you have not been on part of the process, but if you had been, like some of the folks through all these years, every one of my budget presentations has come with a lot of graphics, a lot of handwritten drawings, and stories I've tried to tell about where we've been. And it's been pretty much of a haul. It's kind of interesting because when I started in this role in October, like November of 2019, we were sort of making some final touches as an executive team on the budget. We rolled around to January, we had it ready to go, it was being published, and we had COVID hit. And so I think it's one of the only times I think the city has ever had to do an amended budget. And we were all sort of in emergency response mode, you as well. So I would say I characterize the last few years as being, first in a little bit of a first aid mode of just how do we hold everything together? How do we kind of get through year by year and just manage the situation, lead and manage the situation, which is an interesting word for me to use because for so many years, people have tried to move away from manager. There's sort of a negative connotation with that. And it's also sort of interesting because I have to tell people, that's actually in my title. And I think we should be really proud of how we've managed the organization for the best of this community over the last handful of years. So I feel really good about that. Let me just move this forward. And even in all of that, I will say that we've tried really hard not to be hunkered down and just weathering the storm. And I want to just walk through, there's been so many things that have happened because in all the time that we've been hunkered in and trying to make these difficult decisions, we've also said, how do we keep this community moving forward? How do we keep it awesome? How do we keep people engaged and hopeful? And so there's been a lot of stuff that's happened to keep Eugene the place to be. One of those is the World Championships. So in the middle of all that, coming out of COVID, the World Championships were delayed and we had this, incredible riverfront festival that was free to the community for 10 days. Really fun event. We've opened the Farmers Market Pavilion. We've moved forward on a new city hall for us. And I think there's just so many examples of the Riverfront Park, a lot of different parks that have been built, the two-way bikeways, just a lot of progress, even during times where we've been pretty stressed. And that's just the public side of it. If you look to the private, you see a lot of housing that's been built. You see the development at the Fifth Street Market and the Gordon and the exterior mall that people are just really loving. So there's just been a lot of really good things. And I think we focus a lot on the things that are hard. And I'm sharing some projects. We've also innovated a lot of services along the way to respond to the things that have been really hard. And you've been a part of all of that. So I just wanted to mention that. When we started all of this, we kind of had a big plan. And I've shown this picture a lot, but it really what happened to me, and then I promise I won't show you this picture every year for the rest of my life. But what really happened to me in the very first budget I was presenting to you was this real recognition that that what was happening is we were interpreting a lot of policy and a lot of priorities. We were proposing the budget, which is at the top of the clock. And then we spent a lot of time sort of reviewing and going through it with the group. And it felt like some of that needed to happen ahead of time. Like, how do we do a better job of really understanding the priorities as we're building the budget? And so and kind of get into a better cycle that we've been working really hard to do. And that actually started with a recognition of the value of being much more transparent and engaged with the budget committee. So one of the very first things I committed to doing after that first year is, hey, I've got a slide that's supposed to be moving. It's just not doing it yet. We'll see if it does it eventually. There we go. Very first thing we did was say, hey, when we're not just going to take the supplemental budget to the council, we're going to do a presentation in December. We're going to let you have a look at it and give us some feedback on it. It's sort of a mid-year check-in. But even before that, we said, hey, before we can really get those plans and priorities, we really need to understand what the community wants. So we implemented a community survey. Since I've shown this first diagram, we implemented the first one we've done in 10 years. We got a lot of really good feedback from that. And then we actually did go through and follow through in developing our strategic plan, which builds off the existing vision goals values and goals of the city council. So they're very nested together. And all of that has allowed us to really bring together, I think, a different type of budget. And we've been working towards, I called it initially a priority-based budget. We're thinking more of it as a program-based budget, and I can say more about that later if I need to, but it has more to do with, we're sort of understanding and assessing programs. Really, at the end of the day, the adoption of the budget is the prioritization. And in doing that and switching to a biennial budget where we're doing that every 2 years, we can actually focus more on the kind of engagement, implementation, adapting, and monitoring more than we have to spend on the planning and all the work around sort of getting it together. And you'll hear later in this presentation how that's, I think, already paying off for us. So I'm going to turn it back over to Mauricio. He actually has the most interesting information, and Twyla, and we'll come back and you can ask me anything you'd like.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So good evening, everyone. I'm Mauricio Badalico, and I'll be providing an overview of the current general fund forecast. So I'd like to start with a look back at the 2023 to 2025 adopted budget forecast. This chart shows the surplus deficit, which indicates if we're living within our means. Ideally, we would like to be a lot above the red dotted line in surplus territory, where revenues are greater than expenditures and we are contributing to reserves. Below the red dotted line, we are operating in a deficit position where expenditures are outpacing revenues and we are depleting reserves. The solid blue line assumed $8.3 million of ongoing new revenue starting in FY25, which helps us move from a deficit to a surplus in the out years of this forecast. The green dotted line shows our trajectory without the assumed new revenue. As we walk through the current forecast and the various changes since the budget was adopted, you will see that the gap has grown and the revenue need is now greater than the $8.3 million per year previously assumed. So before we dig into the details, this is just a brief summary of the forecast changes that are typically updated during the fall. These include incorporating our actual audit results from the prior fiscal year and the proposed supplemental budget request that you'll hear more about from Twyla later in the presentation. So the current forecast includes two sources of increased revenue, eWeb SILT and interest on investments, as shown on the left. We'll take a closer look at these revenues on the next couple of slides. There are also a few sources of decreased revenue, as you can see on the right. Local marijuana tax revenue continues to come down from pandemic level highs due to oversupply and ongoing low retail prices. Recreation revenues are lower primarily due to reduced programming caused by ongoing staffing issues. Muni Court's fines revenue in FY23 came in lower than anticipated, and they expect that trend to continue in the current biennium. The adopted budget assumed various revenue strategies to generate new revenue, such as increasing fees. Some of these new revenue strategies are taking longer to implement than originally anticipated, so the assumed revenue in the biennium has been reduced. And we have also reduced our property tax revenue projection, and we'll take a deeper dive on this topic a little bit later. So eWeb's latest forecast for contributions in lieu of taxes, or SILT, is higher than previously projected. This is due to higher electric price increases and a less conservative electrification forecast for electric vehicles. The chart at the top shows the higher electric rate increases in the current forecast compared to the adopted budget forecast. The chart in the middle shows the breakdown of each rate increase from eWeb, which now incorporates pre-funding for decommissioning costs for the Lieberg Dam hydroelectric facility as highlighted in yellow. The chart at the bottom shows the resulting annual SILT revenue increases included in the current forecast. It's worth noting that SILT revenue is influenced by the weather, and we receive the most SILT during the colder winter months. If winter weather turns out to be warmer than anticipated, that has the potential to offset some of the projected revenue increases from higher prices. Interest on investments revenue is based on the investment portfolio earnings rate and the average cash balance in the fund. This revenue is projected to increase due to higher assumed investment portfolio earnings rates as shown in the top chart. The bottom chart shows the resulting annual interest revenue increases included in the current forecast. So now let's talk about property taxes, which is by far the largest revenue source in the general fund at around 70% of total revenues. We have updated our property tax projections based on new data from the tax assessor and an updated analysis of building permit data. I indicated earlier that property tax revenue has been reduced in the current forecast, and we'll cover this in more detail in the next few slides. This chart shows the city's growth in taxable assessed value. On the far right-hand side, you will see that the FY24 growth rate came in at 3.8%, which is lower than our previous 4% projection. The average growth rate over the last 5 years has also been 3.8%, so we have lowered the assumed growth rate in the current forecast from 4% down to 3.8%. One contributing factor towards the lower taxable assessed value growth rate is the declining change property ratio. The change property ratio is a countywide average of assessed value to real market value for properties within the same classification. This chart shows the change property ratio trend for the most common property types. The ratios are going down because real market values are growing faster than assessed values. The change property ratio is important because it's used to determine the assessed value of new construction for the first year on the tax roll. After that, assessed value growth is limited to 3% per year. A good recent example is one of the new student housing complexes on East Broadway that just came on the tax roll this year. It has a real market value of $90 million, but its initial assessed value was set at just $36 million after applying the multifamily change property ratio of 0.4. Said another way, the city will receive property tax revenue based on 40% of the units in that building, but we will provide services to all the units. Another key point is that lower change property ratios mean that it now takes more new construction value to generate the same amount of tax revenue. So this is how much new construction value it took in FY14 to generate $1 million of general fund property tax revenue. Fast forward to FY24, and it now takes significantly more new construction value to generate the same $1 million of tax revenue. This chart shows the value of building permits on taxable property in the city. The bars show taxable building permit activity for each fiscal year, which are lined up with the permit year at the bottom of the chart. For this purpose, building permit data is scrubbed to remove permit values that are exempt from property taxes or that fall within an urban renewal district. The end result is that we are looking at building permit values that would be taxable for the city. The black line shows the annual percentage change in taxable property value that we saw a few slides back. This line aligns with the budget year as shown at the bottom of the chart. We've lined up the budget year with the permit data from 2 years prior, as we estimate that it takes roughly 2 years to make it onto the tax roll after a building permit is issued. So for example, FY23 permit data helps us project what to expect in the FY25 budget year. While this isn't a perfect methodology, there is general alignment between these measures. One key takeaway from this chart is that taxable building permit activity remained relatively consistent in FY23, which supports the reduced 3.8% projection for taxable value growth. Here's a look at our top taxpayers in FY24. I won't go through the whole list, but I will point out a few of the more significant changes from last year. Comcast's assessed value increased 42%, moving back into the top spot in FY24. Comcast reached a property tax settlement with the state of Oregon back in 2018. That settlement included predetermined values through FY23, so it appears the assessed value essentially reset back to normal in FY24. However, the increase from Comcast was more than offset by significant decreases for Verizon Communications and Lumen Technologies. Verizon's assessed value decreased by 26%, and Lumen Technologies fell out of the top 10 after a 46% drop. Utilities and telecommunication companies are centrally assessed by the state of Oregon and do not follow typical growth patterns. Central assessment can result in volatile changes in assessed value from year to year. I did reach out to the Department of Revenue for more information regarding these changes, but haven't heard back yet. The overall assessed value for this group of top taxpayers actually decreased by almost 4% overall in FY24. The other key driver of property tax revenue is the collection rate. Based on our actual collection experience over the last 5 years, we have increased the collection rate projection from 95.5% to 95.7% in the current forecast. This action offsets some of the loss from the reduced taxable value growth rate assumption. Here's a summary of the current property tax assumptions that we reviewed compared to the previous forecast. The chart on the bottom shows the net revenue impact of these changes. I also want to point out some anticipated exceptions as shown in red that will drive growth in taxable assessed value higher than the base increase in FY25 and 26. These exceptions were included in the previous forecast and continue in the current forecast in addition to the base growth of 3.8% in taxable value. So now let's shift gears from revenues to expenses. We have several sources of increased expenditures in the current forecast as shown on the left, and one decreased expenditure as shown on the right. So this supplemental budget includes personnel service adjustments due to increased labor contract costs and market study adjustments over what was estimated during budget preparation. The current forecast assumes these additional costs are carried forward through the remainder of the forecast period. Risk rates are assessed to cover insurance and claims costs for unemployment, workers' compensation, liability, and property. Claims are the largest expense driver for the rates, and year-to-year experience shows a high degree of volatility. Projected insurance premiums continue to be on the rise due to natural disasters such as wildfires and severe storms, both in our region as well as across the country. These costs associated with property damage are trending higher due to a variety of factors such as increased labor and supply costs, which all drive up the cost of premiums. The city's health plans are experiencing a larger number of high-cost claims, increased plan usage, and rising medical inflation. Future health benefit rates have increased from the previous forecast based on the most current health plan trend survey data from our benefits actuary. And we'll talk about PERS rates and the pension bonds rate in more detail on the next couple of slides. PERS rate changes occur every other year. The PERS actuary released the results of the 2022 valuation, and they estimated that net system average rates will increase by 3.1% of payroll in the next biennium. We tend to be on the higher side of the system average, so we have increased the rate projection from plus 2% of payroll to plus 4%. This will add an estimated $1.6 million of ongoing expenses starting in FY26. The primary driver for higher PERS rates in the next biennium is poor investment returns in 2022 and 2023. When investment returns fall short of the assumed rate of return, employer contribution rates must increase to make up the difference. It's important to note that the 2022 valuation is advisory, and our actual PERS rates for the next biennium will be based on the 2023 valuation. We'll receive Eugene-specific advisory rates later this month, but we won't know our actual PERS rates for the next biennium until this time next year. In 2002, the city issued pension obligation bonds to pay down the estimated unfunded PERS liability at that time. Since then, the city has assessed an annual percentage of employee wages in order to pay the debt service on these bonds. This rate is reviewed annually and is adjusted as needed to ensure adequacy of fund resources without collecting more than required. In the adopted budget, the pension bond rate was budgeted at 5.5% of wages. However, we anticipate lowering the pension bond rate to 4% in the second year of the current biennium. The chart at the bottom shows the resulting annual expense reduction. The bonds are projected to be paid off in FY28, so this expense will be eliminated starting in FY29. The Oregon Office of Economic Analysis issues inflation forecasts 4 times per year. This chart shows the forecast from December 2022 and the most recent forecast from December 2023, which is almost identical. Actual inflation peaked at 7.2% in FY22, dropped to 6.3% in FY23, and is projected to drop below 3% in FY24 and move closer to 2% in the coming years. The forecast would be significantly impacted if inflation continues to remain elevated. For example, an increase of just 1% annually over the inflation rates assumed in the current forecast would increase costs by an estimated $20 million over the forecast period. So now let's see the impact of the various revenues and expense changes since the previous forecast. This chart shows the surplus deficit, and ideally we want to be in surplus territory above the red dotted line. So this is the adopted budget forecast that assumed $8.3 million of ongoing new revenue per year starting in FY25. This is the current forecast with the same $8.3 million of ongoing new revenue, which results in a worse position than the adopted budget forecast. So this is the current forecast with an additional $2.2 million of new revenue starting in the next biennium in FY26 for a total of $10.5 million of ongoing new revenue per year. This additional new revenue is needed to improve the surplus deficit to a similar position as the adopted budget forecast. However, it is important to note that this higher new revenue amount is a minimum placeholder that does not include any additional needs beyond the current service system and does not solve the long-term structural gap. This is the current forecast without any new revenue, which would result in deep deficits throughout the forecast period. And now let's look at our savings account, also known as the Reserve for Revenue Shortfall. You'll hear more from Twyla later about the importance of having adequate reserves. Please note the red dotted line represents a zero reserve level. This is the savings account target of 4% of biennial expenses. This is the adopted budget forecast that did include the $8.3 million of ongoing new revenue. The increase above the target level at the end of the forecast is driven by the payoff of pension bonds that I mentioned earlier. This is the current forecast with the same $8.3 million of new revenue, which results in reserves below the target level through the forecast period. This is the current forecast with the additional $2.2 million of new revenue, which is needed to increase reserves above the target and reach a similar level as the adopted budget by the end of the forecast period. And this is the current forecast without any new revenue, which would quickly deplete reserves. So we also ran a what-if scenario to illustrate how the revenue need can change quickly. The base forecast assumes that cost of living adjustments for all years where bargaining units do not have a contract in place are tied to the projected inflation rates that we saw earlier. In this what-if scenario, we replace the projected inflation with cost of living increases of 4% per year for all general fund employee groups through the next biennium. The chart at the bottom shows the resulting cost increases above the base forecast. So let's see how the what-if scenario impacts the surplus deficit. So this is the what-if scenario with the same $8.3 million of new revenue, which results in a significantly worse position than the adopted budget forecast. So this is the what if forecast with an additional $7.7 million of new revenue starting in FY26 for a total of $16 million of ongoing new revenue per year in order to improve the surplus deficit to a similar position as the adopted budget forecast. If the what if scenario assumed 5% cost of living increases instead of 4%, the revenue need would increase further to $19 million per year. And now we'll see the impact of the what if scenario on the reserve for revenue shortfall. This is the what if scenario, again, with the same $8.3 million of new revenue, which would deplete reserves by the next biennium. And this is the what if forecast with the additional $7.7 million, reaching a similar reserve level as the adopted budget by the end of the forecast period. So I'll wrap up my portion of the presentation with this list of future risks and uncertainties. These items have been on this list before, so I won't go through them in detail, but it's important to note that these items have the potential to significantly impact the forecast as we look to the future. And now I'll turn it over to Twyla to review the supplemental budget.
Great. Thank you so much, Mauricio. Good evening, everyone. I'm Twyla Miller, the Chief Financial Officer for the city. And I'm going to share a very high-level overview tonight of the supplemental budget actions, and I'll reference pages that were in the packet that I sent you last week where you can find more detail. And we certainly can answer any questions you have later in the presentation after we complete our presentation. So I'd like to start first by thinking about a biennial cycle versus an annual cycle. So in an annual budget cycle, the December supplemental budget is the largest supplemental budget each year as we trip audit actions in addition to recognizing grants and other budget investments. In a biennial budget framework, the process is slightly different over the 2-year budget cycle. We will continue to conduct a financial audit and produce the annual comprehensive financial report or ACT for each year. But the difference in a biennial budget cycle is that we true-up the budget to reflect the audit adjustments, including marginal beginning working capital, only in the first year of the biennium. So the December supplemental budget in the second year of the biennium will not have marginal beginning working capital, reappropriations, or encumbrance actions. These actions will occur in the first year of the 25-27 biennium, as we will reconcile the audit at the beginning of each biennium rather than with each fiscal year. So with the table on this slide, first we'll look at total funds available for appropriation. Marginal beginning working capital is the adjustment from reconciling the estimates projected for FY23 revenues and expenditures last spring to the actual audited revenues and expenditures as of June 30th. And this is the largest component of funding, as you can see here. More detail on the marginal beginning working capital components and the encumbrance reserve can be found beginning on page 2 of your packet. Also, as Mauricio shared, interest rates are higher than when our estimates were set some time ago, and we are able to recognize $3.5 million in additional revenue this biennium. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA funding of $1.1 million are resources not previously allocated that have been in reserve. This action will liquidate the remaining ARPA reserve and allocate the funds toward police body camera and in-car video replacement. As you can see from the funding appropriations table, many of the budget actions are reappropriations or encumbrances related to work begun in the prior fiscal year that need to be completed in the current biennium. Information on general fund supplemental budget actions are contained in attachment A of your packet beginning on page 7. Additionally, information on ARPA funding is in attachment C, which begins on page 20 of your packet. As the city qualified for revenue recovery, our original ARPA disbursements, we have met the reporting requirement related to ARPA funds and have tracked ARPA allocations related to council direction for transparency. Of note with the ARPA reappropriations is the unhoused ARPA response reappropriation. These funds continue non-shelter related work, including funding for neighborhood service officers and expanded rest stops through the biennium. Funding for expenditures related to Lane County Navigation Center and the Safe Sleep sites are funded through fiscal year 24, which will end this June. The city is pursuing state funding for these shelter-related expenditures for FY25 and beyond. This approach allows for financial stability as we look to the future. Information related to the one-time funding requests is found on page 10 of your packet and includes providing budget authority for personnel adjustments that were finalized after the proposed budget was prepared last spring, and investments to support equipment for public safety, support of downtown operations, and state mandated planning efforts. The next piece on the slide are two key transfers, and we're fully funding those for the biennium. This is the General Capital Preservation and Maintenance Transfer, which is a priority in our financial policies, and the Affordable Housing Trust Transfer. These funds are a high priority of marginal beginning working capital. We've included 2 years of funding here, which is important as there will not be marginal beginning working capital in the second year of the biennium to fund these efforts. More detail is on page 11 in your packet. And then we did receive almost $650,000 more in opioid settlement funds than projected in FY23. These funds have very specific uses for the terms of the legal settlement and will be placed in a reserve pending future allocation by council. So after all of these funding actions, $3.6 million is proposed to be placed in a reserve for revenue shortfall to help with financial stability. And I'll talk a little bit more about the reserve later. Next slide, please. So this shows the detail for the non-general fund supplemental budget actions. And this information begins on page 14 of your packet. Many of the actions are related to audit results, including reappropriations and also recognizing grants. One-time funding requests include investments at the airport that reflect the growth the airport is experiencing, as well as funding for system development capital project increases related to park and trail projects. Next slide. You also received a separate packet for the Urban Renewal Agency budget. Most of the actions are related to truing at the audit, but the appropriations shown here on this slide are related to 2 of the one-time funding requests, which are on page 2 of the Urban Renewal packet. The first is making appropriations for the downtown district. Council gave direction on the future of the downtown district after the 23-25 budget was prepared. These are the necessary budget actions to right-size appropriations to reflect council direction. The second item is related to the steam plant security and maintenance to protect the existing structure from vandalism and trespassing while maintaining a safe environment. Additionally, council is currently discussing future options for the Riverfront District. Budget actions related to those decisions will be included on a future second-year budget. And finally, I'd like to touch briefly on reserves. The reserve for revenue shortfall is our financial cushion. It's a very key part of our financial management. Having an adequate reserve allows us to weather unexpected events and take time to develop thoughtful, strategic responses rather than having to take immediate action to cut services. Additionally, having a sufficient reserve is a factor in our credit rating, which translates into lower borrowing costs for the city, saving taxpayer resources over the long term. Moody's, which is our credit rating agency, recognizes the strong financial management of the city, including maintaining strong reserve levels, which is a key metric in their valuation. Our biennial target for this reserve is 4% of general fund expenditures, or about $16 million on average over the forecast period. By adding funds to the reserve on this supplemental budget, our reserve will be at 3.4%, so still short of our desired target, but it's a prudent financial decision that gives us flexibility. As Maurizio discussed in his forecast overview, adding funds to the reserve now allows us to step into future strategies over 2 years instead of having them all occur in the coming year in FY25. We've used reserves to help us through the Great Recession, as well as the pandemic, and just to respond to other unexpected events that happen over time. Building adequate reserves will be a key part of our long-term financial planning and management as we look to our future. So next, Sarah will talk about our strategic planning and budgeting process before we wrap things up.
Thanks, Twyla. So this list really just sort of reiterates what I showed you in that initial cycle of things we've recently undertaken. And the next couple of slides will talk about sort of where we're going next. So really starting at the end of 2023 and then leading into 2024, We have the city manager's revenue advisory team that is a small group, includes a couple of budget committee members, Eliza and Raina. That group is going to look at the revenue report that staff did and start to think about what are some possibilities here, and also start to understand the issue at an even deeper level when we start to look at how did we get here? What are the systemic, just kind of issues that are happening with all of our revenue streams that get us here. We are also doing some updates to the program-based budget. So the first time around, we did a really good job of understanding all of the different programs and being able to assign our costs to all the different programs. And now we're starting to look through all of them. And I've asked, the council probably knows this more than anybody, but we've asked every single program area to look at what it would look like to reduce their programs across the board, every single one, mostly because I'm trying to understand what are the implications for everybody to reduce. Ideally, in a great world, you'd be asking them also how they would grow and what are the needs. And we'll get there. A couple of things coming up soon. So council is going to consider an update or consider a possibility of a capital bond to support the Lane County multi-use stadium. And we'll be coming back also just a little bit after that with information that we gleaned from the revenue team and what we learned from the service program assessments. Next slide. So I think the bigger, next question is like, what happens next? Are there new revenue strategies or new methodologies that we may implement next year and then the next year? We're going to be, we've talked a little bit about this, taking a longer term look at our financial planning, sort of more like we do kind of growth of the city. How do we just look even farther out so we can project those things that are coming? And finding solutions for that. So as you know from the slide that Mauricio showed, some of the property tax limitations are just, we're always going to end up in the same place. And I'd ideally like to get us to a place where you have different options going forward. And there's some good examples of that, the places that are happening, a couple of places in the state and some across the country. And we'll continue to evolve the program budget. It's been, I want to just be honest, like switching to a biennial budget and a program-based budget and doing this work that's structural is really hard. It's been a lot of work for staff. And we're kind of in the middle of it. And it's like a long book where you're in the middle and you're kind of like, why did I start reading this book in the first place? So we're going to get through it. And I have a lot of hope for the ways that can inform your decision-making going forward. Next slide. So these are the most immediate. So next week, the council will take action on the supplemental budget for the city and for the urban renewal agencies. And they'll have the bond discussion, we'll have a revenue discussion, and then we'll be coming back out to you with kind of what does that schedule look for you on the right side of that now that we're not doing the budget every single year? How do we engage? What are the policies we want you to advise us on? So more to come on that. And with that, I think we're done with the presentation and ready for your comments.
Thank you very much for the fabulous presentation. I'm going to go ahead and then go right into our round robin. Skipping over people who are absent, that makes the first person I'm going to turn it to Councilor Zelenka.
I don't have any questions this time. It was very thorough. Thanks for the info.
Thank you. Councilor Groves.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have any questions at this time either. I've already had a chance to kind of look at this. I do really appreciate the presentation. I think the team does a great job in preparing this for us, and I know I certainly learn something every time I see it in the graphic form. I mean, talking about it's one thing, but having that graphic visual representation I find extremely helpful. Naturally, I'm concerned, like I think we all are, with our financial situation and taxation in Oregon. But I'm also confident that we're going to be able to figure this out. Thank you.
Thank you. Zach Mulholland.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I just have a couple questions around timeline and process for revenue and for cuts. You mentioned that you've asked staff to look at what potential cuts to programs could look like. Can you share anything about the results of like order of magnitude of what might be possible there without having, really detrimental effects on programs? And
yeah, I can't. Do you want to ask your next question first, or do you want me to just answer that first?
That'd be great if you could.
Yeah. So I can't answer that yet because I literally am just starting to review some of the information, and we didn't ask people. We didn't say here's a $8 or $10 or $15 million scenario. Tell us what you do. We really just asked people to be really thoughtful about their programs. Which are mandated, which aren't mandated, and under, regardless of that, what are the ways they see that if they were required to shrink, how would they do it? I actually haven't reviewed it yet, so I can't answer that. I will say this, that the purpose for doing it in this way is for the executive managers, for me and the exec team, to really have a thorough understanding of what's happening in all parts of the organization, because we feel strongly, and I feel strongly, that our job is to figure out how, if we can't find a revenue solution, how do we maintain the best and the most of what makes this such a great city? So we'll certainly be coming back with more information to council, and we've been talking about how do we engage the full budget committee in that discussion as well.
Thank you. I look forward to that discussion playing out. I think obviously there's some interplay between what cuts are feasible and what revenue is feasible, and so just if you have any comments or thoughts on how those two processes interplay with each other, looking at potential cuts and the revenue committee meeting and talking about revenue. Do you have thoughts on how the interplay of those two processes?
Not completely defined. So yes, in that, our job, what we're really trying to understand is what's the real story of what I would be presenting based on everything I've learned about vision, values, goals, strategic plan, just understanding of the community. What would I be presenting? And then, also what is the, are there revenue solutions for all of that, or are there not? I don't want to do any sort of a proposal that is just based on what we think people would support. We want to be really real about what would the city look like. I do have some thoughts and ideas based on other communities of different ways to fund different services that we will take a look at. We've looked at a little bit in the revenue report, and we'll continue to with the advisory group.
And then what are you thinking in terms of timeline for both processes, or for just the revenue process leading into this year's budget?
Twyla, do you want to answer that?
Yes, so the revenue advisory group will start later this month. The first meeting is the 18th. I expect those meetings to happen in the kind of December, January timeframe. Concurrently, as Sarah discussed, we will be having some discussions and reviewing programs with the hope that we bring back something to council later in January, just understanding that fiscal year 25 begins in July. So we need to start to understand all of our options and receive some direction from council so that we can start to move forward as we come through the winter.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ryan Moore.
Thank you. And again, thanks for letting us be part of this process. For me, it's just very fulfilling to be able to have a voice. I have two quick questions, hopefully. I was wondering if we could just get a little more detail. There's a one-time funding request for the rental code enforcement program. It's $150,000, but there's not much detail on how that's used. I should have asked my budget buddy, but didn't even occur to me that I could.
Sarah, you want to take that one, Sarah?
Yes, please.
When we created the renter protections kind of new program area, we anticipated that there would be some enforcement that's part of that program, but we really weren't sure to what scale. So we haven't filled that position. We don't intend to fill that position immediately, but we know that it might be, depending on the number of complaints and so forth that we get, it might become an issue. So we've kind of reserved an opportunity to use some of the revenue to create that position.
Cool, thank you. And then sort of a big question that may not be answerable. Do we know what the city's revenues would be if measures 5 and 50 weren't on the books? So if property taxes could go up along with property values instead of being capped at 3% increases?
We do not know that. I wasn't around in Oregon when measures 5 and 50 went in, but my understanding back then is taxing jurisdictions determined how much they needed to balance their budget and then gave that amount to the tax assessor, and then the tax assessor spread that out across all the taxable property and actually determined the rate. So it was more based on the needs of the taxing jurisdictions and less on the increase in value, is my understanding. Yeah.
Okay. I think that might be like a good messaging point to have at people's fingertips. Like, if our hands were not tied on this, here is what the city would be able to spend on services, right?
Yeah, we are working on some of that, Ryan, and I will also just add I work with some regularity with the 6 other city managers that are the largest cities in Oregon, not including Portland, and those mayors also coordinate, and maybe the mayor will speak to this when she goes, but all of us are taking a look at that to understand what are the implications and what is it costing people, because it ends up costing on the other side with levies.
Yep. Cool. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Leach.
Hi, thank you. I don't have any questions today. I just wanted to thank Twyla for reviewing the supplemental budget with me earlier in the week. Definitely helps to get a second look and read. So that was a really great presentation on that really complicated information. So I just appreciate it all. So thank you.
Thank you. That brings it to me. I don't think I have any particular questions. Like has been said before, I want to thank staff for the very high quality packet and presentation. That's why I don't really have any questions now. I was able to come into this with the information at hand. I just want to note how concerning it is that the only forecasts that aren't utterly dire involve huge amounts of mystery revenue. It's not that easy to find revenue, so the fact that we absolutely have to, or else we're in very deep trouble, is of course something we're all concerned about. I feel it needed to be said out loud in those terms, but I also know that we're working really hard on finding options for it. So I'm looking forward to seeing some results of that work and seeing where we land. That's all I really have. Thank you. Next is Arena Jackson.
No questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Eliza Kaczynski.
Thank you. And thank you also for the excellent presentations and the supplemental budget and allowing us to come together and have this conversation around it. I do want to say that I was really happy to see the transfer to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and especially that 2-year transfer, and as well really relieved to see the money that we were able to put into the reserve as well, because I know that's very important. I have two questions. One is sort of detail oriented and one is bigger picture. One of the one-time fundings was for downtown operations. And that talks about repurposing unspent one-time funding. So I was a little confused. Is that sort of more of a reappropriation, or is that additional funding for that purpose?
I can jump in, Sarah, if no one else wants to take it. So we had basically in the downtown operation program, if you remember, we had an ambassador program. Last year, we chose to eliminate that program, and that decision was made earlier enough that we started to have a lot of vacancies in the downtown ops program because the ambassadors found other job opportunities and so forth. So we used most of that savings from the previous year were the downtown ops ambassador part of the program. So it is a reappropriation of basically the savings from the previous year.
Okay, thank you. Sort of my bigger question, to make sure that I understand, in the previous budget or in the current budget that we're in right now, there was that $8.3 million of new revenue strategies that was scheduled to start fiscal year 2025, which would be July 1, 2024. And the idea was that between July 1, 2024 and June 30th, 2025, we'd identify a revenue strategy that would bring in $8.3 million through that time frame. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. So identifying either new revenues or service changes or some combination of the two for the second year of the biennium, which starts this July.
And if I'm understanding correctly from the forecast presentation, if we want to not be in this same position a year from now, 2 years from now, I guess a year and a half from now, we would actually be looking for revenue strategies that bring in more than $8.3 million or other adjustments that are greater than that, depending on how things shake out. So now we're looking for 10.5 per year. Is that right?
Right. So with the current forecast, with the assumptions we have in the current forecast, it's grown from 8.3 in 25 to 8.3 in 25 plus an additional 2.2 in 26.
Okay,
right?
so it'd be
with that current set of circumstances. The way I think about this a little bit, Eliza, is a kind of a short-term and a long-term. So we have this, what I call a short-term gap, which is what the revenue advisors and what we're talking about in the forecast in the current biennium. So based on what we know, the number could be larger. You know, as a reminder, there are other things. So, as we negotiate contracts in the future, or we have other needs that aren't in our current service system, that number could go higher. The other thing I think about is the long-term implications. So we have a short-term problem and a long-term problem. As Maurizio described when he was describing the property tax system, even with adjustments in this biennium, eventually, as we come into the future of the forecast, with our current property tax system, we still have a structural gap long-term as you think out in the out years of the forecast. So we've got that short-term issue and a long-term issue.
Yeah, and I will actually say, like, that gives me actually a little bit of hope. This is like a very budget that makes us all feel very down and, like, as Ty mentioned, not a great situation. But I will say that one of the things that I was getting very nervous about is the ability to implement any funding strategy at this juncture that would bring in money before the beginning of fiscal year 2025. And it seems like we can maybe work something out so that even if it doesn't bring in money right away, it will still help mitigate, even if it doesn't start bringing dollars in the door until this time next year. And so, thank you. Talking a little bit about this is still a huge challenge, but I'm glad to be able to come out with a little bit of hope. So thank you.
Thank you. Siobhan Cancel.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you for the presentation. I have more thoughts than I do have questions, so I'll wait till those thoughts get downloaded and become questions. One question I did have was it showed a decrease in court fines, and it made me wonder, does that mean we're experiencing less crime, or are we more leaning towards forgiveness and non-payment of fees?
Hi there, Mia Carriaga, Central Services Director. The majority of the decrease in fines at court is due to decreased activity overall. It doesn't have anything to do with forgiving fines.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and just to and just one more note, which is that activity is already back up on the rise, and so we don't anticipate the same decrease in revenue in the future.
Oh, and then I did have one other question, and maybe I missed the slide. I saw the what if scenario, and I saw it with the 10 million, but I feel like just before that we were talking about the 2.2 million. Is there a what if scenario with the calculation of just the 2.2 million? Was that presented?
No, we didn't do just two. The options were we keep the same 8.3, which was already built into the budget. The other option was we add 2.2 to that, or the probably the worst scenario we saw was if we don't bring in any revenue altogether. So we didn't do just the 2.2. The 2.2 was in addition to the 8.3 to bring it up to 10.5.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I feel like I heard something that made it like 16 or 17.
That's correct. That was the what if scenario. So so the 10.5 is the revenue need in our new base case scenario. But in the what if those costs of cost of living increases are higher than the inflationary factors we're currently considering or currently projected, the revenue need would then increase from 10.5 up to 16 million would be the revenue need under the what if scenario.
Okay, awesome. And thank you so much. I yield the rest of my time.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Keating.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sarah and Twyla and Maurizio for the presentation this evening. And it's nice to see a full complement of budget committee members with us for the supplemental budget process. Maurizio mentioned that the revenue's down for cannabis revenue. Yet we live in a community in which there are more cannabis stores than there are McDonald's and 7-Elevens combined. Are we realizing the maximum benefits for our municipal cannabis taxes, or are we leaving money on the table?
My understanding is we are at max, the legal max of 3% for the local marijuana tax. There has been talk at the legislature and draft bills to allow cities to increase that, but right now we are at maximum.
Okay. Good to know. So for our IGR members on the call, I'd be interested in exploring how we can get behind such efforts to increase our benefits. Twyla, I thank you for meeting with me earlier in the week and for responding to my series of questions. I'm looking for just a little clarification about the urgent community needs bucket on page 10. In particular, the funding for downtown safe and clean community. There's a $420,000 line item, and in particular, it talks about supporting staffing for a pilot program focused on various sanitation needs. And it's my understanding that that particular budget item allows for 3 limited duration park specialists who will apparently provide a rapid response to calls for service downtown to help resolve issues that are various biohazards and a prompt cleanup in a timely fashion. Does my understanding track? Is that an accurate snapshot as to what that line item is?
Yes, Councilor Keating, that is, I did confirm with planning and development staff that that is the plan for that funding.
Thanks. So those are limited duration personnel who are going to be dealing with biohazards. And it's my understanding the last time we did our budget process, we had discussed and had a thirst, or at least some of us had a thirst for a new downtown loo. And if my back of the napkin math is accurate, that's around the same price tag as this particular line item. Is there any flexibility within this budget or future budgets to re-explore another downtown loo, a downtown restroom?
So as part of our budget this year, as part of our biennial budget, we did repurpose the loo dollars that to advance other efforts in this biennium. I would say in the future, we can always consider things in the future as we look to the future, as far as the new downtown and the best services to produce the outcomes we're looking for. So it's not that it's off the table forever, but at the time, with all the changes we were making in this biennium, we felt that that was the prudent strategy for this biennium. I don't know if Mia or others have something to pop on it, if she has other thoughts there.
Yes, thank you. I would just add that in addition, one of the reasons why we were comfortable pulling that funding and looking to potentially bringing it back at a later date was that facilities staff was working with Eric Brown to place a loo, and we were having difficulty finding a place downtown that was agreeable for businesses in the downtown core and could actually work operationally and within our infrastructure. So there were a couple of reasons why we moved forward with that. And the other piece that I would add is that our incident commander, our downtown incident commander, is working on a number of ways to address the issues that we often see with biohazards. And it may or may not be, depending on how things go with other options, that we need a loo in the same way or for the same reason in the future.
Yeah, I would think that a loo would be a wise long-term investment. I'm just cautious about such a pilot program and limited duration personnel. Are these park specialists going to be full-time? Are they part-time? The limited duration piece gives me a little concern. Are they going to be properly trained to deal with such biohazards? I suspect there might be quite a significant turnover in having that to be your one's primary focus. And for the same price tag, investing in a loo, I think would be welcome and embraced by the community. Just want to learn a little bit more about those limited duration park specialists. Are they going to be represented employees? Are they full-time status? What's their training like? And how are we going to ensure their safety if they're dealing with such hazards on their streets?
Just pop in here talking about our strategy downtown. So this is the pilot project aspect of this is really around how do we get more efficient with what we're seeing. And what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of some of the prohibitive camping and some of our encampments that come with a large amount of property and biohazard and trash. So it's not just about somebody needing to have access to a bathroom. It's about the waste that's left behind when we're trying to move people out of the illegal encampments. And really what the strategy is here is to try and identify a team that can immediately respond to these so that officers actually can be in a place where they can try and find somewhere else for people to go and not be encumbered with all of the stuff and all of the cleanup that is associated with that. So in the downtown strategy, it is around safe, clean, and activated. And part of that additional strategy is to be responsive to the cleanliness and being able to do it in a timely fashion. We have officers that oftentimes, once they start down the path of a project of something like this, now they're encumbered for hours on end because they have to gather everybody's belongings. Really what this looks like is an officer being able to come in, do what an officer should be doing, and then remove themselves and allow for the right kind of staff to come in and be able to do the cleanup and gathering of personal belongings, storage of personal belongings, and then the return of those personal belongings if appropriate.
Great. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mia. Thank you, Twyla, for the clarifications. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Jesse is needed to go board his airplane, so that brings us to Councillor Semple.
Thank you. Thank you for the reports and especially the graphs. Getting back to revenue, and this isn't something we can do, but I'm curious as to what it takes to reassess the values of property. Is that something that the state would need to do, because they haven't been reassessed forever and they're exploding in value? Not that I want people to have to sell their house to pay the taxes at all, but I'm just wondering, we're so stagnant in there. How would that be able to change?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Semple. One thing I will say, I'm not exactly sure how often or frequent the tax assessor reassesses properties, but one thing I will say, I believe they do have the ability to reassess the real market value, but the market value, the issue we have is that the lower assessed value is limited to 3% growth per year, and that's what we receive the tax revenue on. So even if a house is, say a house, with the market value is 300,000 and it gets increased to 500,000, it doesn't change the assessed value. So that doesn't help.
I understand that. Yeah. My question is the assessed value. Will we ever go back and look at that? I realize we're not taxing on the market value at all, but there's a huge difference between the assessed value and the market value, and the assessed value goes up so slowly, it doesn't seem like it can keep up with inflation.
That's correct. So much of our property tax system, including those elements, are locked in the Oregon State Constitution, so would require action by the legislature and a vote of the people of Oregon to initiate significant change.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you, Councillor Ye.
Thank you so much for the presentation, but I do not have any questions at this time, so thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. At this time, I would love to invite Mayor Vinis to contribute any thoughts she may have.
Thank you so much, Chair. I don't have any questions. I will just say, as been said in the presentations, which I really, really appreciate, that, we're all recognizing that cities across the state have this same problem, that we're all confronting these exact same constraints, and that I know that the League of Oregon Cities is doing a lot of work and research around this issue, and the Oregon Mayors Association is looking at it. So I think that collectively we are looking for the changes that we can make that might, at least in the very beginning, sort of bring the legislature a little bit more on board with the constraints that cities are facing in terms of actually being able to pay our bills. So that work is ongoing, but I really appreciate the Maurizio, your presentation was really, really helpful. I feel like I need to hear this over and over again for it to really sink in, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Now that everyone has spoken, did anyone have a need of a second round? Anything pop back into your mind after your turn came up? All right. In that case, I just want to thank everyone for the discussion. I think it was very valuable. I'm glad we were able to have it. And we can roll right into minutes approval. Minutes were sent out from the May 24th meeting last spring. Did anyone have any recommended changes or comments on those minutes? And if there are no recommendations on that front, then I would welcome a motion to approve those minutes.
I move to approve the minutes from the May 25th, 2023 Budget Committee meeting.
Do I have a second?
Second.
I saw Raina's hand. I'll give her second credit. And in that case, all in favor of the motion to approve the May 24th minutes? I am seeing 12 hands in the air, which is the number of voting members currently on the call. Just to double check that count, did we have any opposed? Did we have any abstentions? Thank you. And that passes 12-0. And with that, we can talk about next steps. So the next step on the supplemental budget is that council will have their opportunity to deliberate and pass that budget at their meeting on December 11th. I want to emphasize for any members of the general public who've been listening along tonight and are still with us that there is an opportunity for public comment at that meeting, which is why we didn't have one here. So if you have thoughts and are not a member of our committee here, then that's when you get to jump in and chime in. After that, we're going to be doing some final development work on the budget calendar for 2024. Obviously, this is the first time we've gotten to do year 2 of a biennium budget where we aren't passing a new budget. So it's how we'll use that year and that time is something we're still working on. And when that calendar is ready, we'll be sharing it as soon as we have it. Anyone who has additional questions or thoughts, comments, that the information they need about the process, email Christina Wozniak. And with that, I think we have done everything we need to do for tonight. So thank you again, everyone, for your attendance. Thank you, staff, for the presentations and all of the information. At 6:52 p.m., we are adjourned.